All right, good morning. I'd invite you to open your Bibles to the book of Job. I preached here, I think it was maybe around a month ago, and we looked at a passage in Ecclesiastes. And I figured that today we would look at another section or another wisdom book in the book of Job this morning. It's good to be with all of you. There's quite a few more people here today than last time. So it's good to rekindle some relationships with some of you and reconnect with some of you I haven't even met, but it's good that you're all here. We can go through a variety of different kinds of trials, and one of the things that I think sometimes can be frustrating for somebody when they're going through a trial is when somebody comes to you and they try to one-up your suffering. As if it's some kind of consolation where you're going through something hard, and because of your circumstance in life, because of how you've been raised, because of how you've been treated in different circumstances, there might be things for you that seem particularly hard that somebody around you may not understand. And so I don't know if you've ever had a time before where you went to somebody and they just basically told you that it could be a lot worse and didn't have a lot of comfort. What does the Bible tell us to do when we're going through something difficult? I want to point to James 5. There's only 2 times that Job is mentioned in the Bible outside of the book of Job. Ezekiel 14 and then James, this passage. James 5, 10, and 11 says, as an example of suffering and patience, brothers, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Behold, we consider those blessed who remain steadfast. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. So, have you obeyed what this passage says? That as an example of patience and suffering, I want you to go back to the prophets. I want you to go back to people like Jeremiah and Amos. And I want you to look at Malachi and the kinds of things that he was told to tell the people. He specifically then brings up Job, and he says a few things about Job here that are interesting to me. He says that Job was steadfast. The idea of steadfastness reminds me of the Greek god Atlas, who's trying to hold up the world, and he's got to make sure that he doesn't drop the ball. I think that might be where that phrase comes from. That he's supposed to bear up under the heavy weight and not let go. The idea of steadfastness means that you're going to have times that are really challenging, and as you're trying to bear up under the trials, that you don't justify sin. What is it that sin promises? Momentary pleasure, maybe an earthly way of fixing the problem. That in the midst of the trial, we never justify any kind of sin. Now, the book of James was written to a people that had been scattered from their homeland. They were going through all kinds of trials and afflictions, and he ends the book by talking about some examples that you can read in Scripture. Now, one of the things that I think is interesting about this is that James is saying here that in the midst of difficulty, don't neglect deep Bible study. Is that something that comes natural to you? I think for me, whenever I've gone through really hard things, the first instinct is to pray, and we should do that. But I think I've prayed to the neglect of what this passage says. Don't neglect deep Bible study of people like this in the Bible when you're going through something difficult. So what I want to do in this lesson is talk about what is it that Job went through and how did he handle all of these different sorts of things. But to set this up, the first couple verses of the book of Job introduce us to Job, and it tells us that he's somebody that fears God and turns away from evil. Have you ever studied how the wisdom books, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, how these books sort of interact with each other and communicate to one another? So, for example, Job begins by saying that he fears God. According to Proverbs, what do we know about the person who fears God? It's the beginning of wisdom. This man is wise, and we would expect from the book of Proverbs that the person who fears God is going to generally have things go pretty well for them. That's kind of the trajectory of the book of Proverbs. So this guy fears God. He turns away from evil. He's from the land of Uz. He's not from any of the places that we know about in the Promised Land. So he's a non-Israelite who knows about the God of Israel. He has 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels. So his farm would have been huge. The number 10 is the number of completion in the Bible. 7 sons and 3 daughters. He would have been the kind of guy that everybody that knew of him would have been jealous of him. He has everything that everybody would have ever wanted. and which makes him the perfect person for what's about to happen in this book. So with that in place, look at Job chapter 1, verses 6 through 11. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, "From where have you come?" Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down on it." And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil?" Then Satan answered the Lord and said, "Does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face." There's a lot of questions that I have about this scene here that I don't know that I'm ever going to get the answer to in this life. But there's times in the Bible where God is pictured as being in this like heavenly council, and he's kind of pictured as this heavenly spiritual king. And you can imagine, I don't think it was like this, but I imagine that he's around this giant table that kings would sit at or something with all these spiritual beings. And then here comes Satan walking into the room. And notice that God initiates the conversation with Satan. He says, "Hey, where have you been?" He's like, "I've been going here and there." And then God says to Satan, "You didn't say anything about Job. What do you think about that guy?" Well, I agree that he serves God. He serves you, that he fears you, and he's blameless and upright and all these kinds of things. But do you notice that Satan has a different interpretation on why Job serves God? He says the only reason that he does this is because you've given him a bunch of goodies. You put this hedge around him. The only reason that he's interested in serving you is because look at all the things that you've given him. Look at all these earthly blessings. But then he says if you take these things away from him, he will curse you to your face. Now, this brings up the question of the book of Job that I think we all need to consider. Would you serve God for nothing? Would you serve God if everything that you cherished was taken away from you? Or would you indeed curse God to his face and say, "You're not worth serving anymore because all of these things that I thought you were giving me and that I was really pursuing you to get have all crumbled around me, so there's no point"? There's some people that come to God using him as a stepping stone to the thing that they really want. And Satan's accusation is that this is the reason you're serving him. It's because of all these things that you get. Now, we're not going to have time to look at all these passages throughout Job, but if you've ever studied chapters 3 through 37, the dialogue, so chapters 1 and 2 shows you the dialogue that happens in the heavenly realm. Chapters 3 through 37 show you the dialogue that happens on earth with Job and his friends. And one of the things that is interesting is that there's times where Job is speaking where he very clearly does not believe in an afterlife. He has no knowledge of it. And then there's other times where he seems to indicate that he's hoping that something like that exists. If you didn't even believe in an afterlife, and everything that you cherished on this earth was lost, would you still see God as worthy of being served? That's sort of the position that Job is in. Look at verse 12. "And the Lord said to Satan, 'Behold, all that he has is in your hand. Only against him do not stretch out your hand.' So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord." God is going to allow this test to happen. Where Satan had said he's going to curse you to your face. By the way, we know throughout the book of Job that Job does not curse God to his face. And this is one of the things that we learn about Satan in this book, is that Satan does not know the future. Satan says that he will curse you to your face, and he never does it. But notice that God is allowing the test. And the book opened up by saying he's a blameless and upright man. There's nothing that this man did that you can point to that would show you this is why all this suffering is about to happen in his life. Now, what I want to do in this next part of the lesson is point out the things that Satan is allowed to disrupt in Job's life. There's been times where I'm not the kind of preacher that likes to have everything start with the same letter. I think sometimes you're trying to force things when you do that. But with Job, this is not forcing anything, and it's also a clever way of remembering it. There's going to be 4 things that Satan is allowed to disrupt in Job's life. And I think that almost all the suffering that I can think of in people that I know, their lives and the lives of other people, the things that you read about on the news, I think all of them can sort of be summarized in these 4 things that begin with the letter F that we're about to look at. The first one are Job's finances. Look at Job chapter 1, verses 13 through 17. Now there was a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And there came a messenger to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them. And the Sabeans fell upon them and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword. And I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them. And I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 groups and made a raid on the camels and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword. And I alone have escaped to tell you. Now that's a really bad day. There's 3 messengers here. Notice that it toggles between the Sabeans and then the third one is the Chaldeans. So it goes people and then some kind of earthly disaster, the fire from God. I think that's talking about lightning that maybe struck the grass on fire or something like that. And then you go back to a group of people. So he's going between earthly things and people that are causing this disruption. But these first 3 messengers, in one moment, what does Job learn? Like, it's like the first messenger comes and right as he's finishing, the next one comes and maybe even interrupts the first one, and happens with the second one as well. He's learning in one moment that his stock market portfolio has been completely liquidated. That because back then, wealth wasn't in a bank. Wealth was bound up in your animals. The day that you shear your sheep is the day that you get paid, or the time period that you get paid. When you milk the cows, everything that you have is built around these animals. And so he learns in one moment that everything gets liquidated. Would you serve God? Would you still serve God if this life that you're trying to build, this goal of getting a house, and you eventually get the nice house, and you have the savings that you want to have, and you have your emergency, like everything is just kind of exactly what you want it to be, and then boom, it all gets taken away. Would you still serve God? From what I understand, in the 2008 stock market crash, there were people on Wall Street that worked in Wall Street that literally committed suicide after everything that they had worked for was taken away from them in one moment. There was some people that I used to study with in California who had their identity stolen. They were new marriage. They were a little bit older. They had kids from other marriages and stuff like this, and they were really struggling financially. And then somehow somebody stole their identity, just liquidated everything. Would you still serve God if all of that was taken away? That's the first F. Second one is family. Now this one gets subdivided into 2 different categories. We can start out with the children. Look at Job chapter 1, verses 18 and 19. While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, your sons and your daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and behold, a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young people, and they are dead, and I alone have escaped to tell you. You notice, by the way, have you ever realized that in this text here, that the text doesn't say that Job's children died? Have you noticed that before? Because when the messenger comes, I think they did die, by the way. I'm not trying to play some trick on you or something. But when the messenger comes, he says to Job that the young people died. Have you ever had news that was so hard to share with somebody that you couldn't just bluntly say what the news was? And you had to say it, but you had to say it in a veiled kind of way so that the person got the point. This messenger doesn't come up to Job and say, hey, your 10 children died. He says, Job, the young people died, and you know who I'm talking about. When my wife and I first moved to Tennessee, there was a guy at the church that was 36 years old, and he was born with hemophilia. So at age 9, he needed a blood transfusion, and the blood donor had AIDS. So here's a 9-year-old who contracts AIDS through no fault of his own whatsoever. And when my wife and I first moved to Nashville, he was 36, and he was in hospice care. He died about 2 weeks later. And I used to get together with the father every week afterwards. And he would cry and cry and cry, and he would say that losing a child is like you're in prison because you're confined to this pain that's never going to go away. But every week we would get together, he would talk about wanting to see him again one day. He didn't take that as an opportunity to shake his fist at God and curse him. Instead, for him, it was an encouragement for him to continually serve God. My wife and I right now have 3 children. My wife is pregnant with our 4th. But between our first and our second, we had a miscarriage. The miscarriage happened early on a Sunday morning, and it was the same day that I was also planning on preaching the story of Elijah raising the widow's child who had died. It was a very emotional day. We never met the child. The child had been in my wife's womb for 10 weeks or something like that. We never got to interact. That was hard enough. Can you imagine losing 10 grown children that you've seen? Look at what they're doing when they die in this story. They're hanging out with each other. They're all getting along in their oldest brother's house. How many parents would just love to see their children get along with one another? They die when they're getting along with one another. It makes it all the more difficult. If you lost a child, would you still serve God? Notice the next one is a spouse. Let's skip over to Job chapter 2. This is after Job's health is struck, and we'll talk about that more in just a moment. But look at Job chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. Then his wife said to him, "Do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die." But he said to her, "You speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips." Do you notice, does it seem like Mrs. Job is speaking like anybody else did in this book? What does she tell Job to do? Curse God and die. Is there anybody else in the book of Job that said something about cursing God? Isn't that what Satan said that Job would do if we can disrupt his life? She's become the voice or the conduit of Satan himself. And I do find it interesting that when Satan had the opportunity to mess up Job's life and destroy everything in it, the one thing he left him with was this wife. I don't know what to make of that. But I do understand from this my impression of the wife. Do you think that they probably had a pretty good marriage? 10 kids together? Like Job is kind of the envy of everybody. I don't think this was a bad marriage. What I think is going on with Job's wife is she's seeing her husband suffer, and she's suffering as well, losing all these children. And she says, just curse God, just renounce him, say that you're done with him, and he'll kill you, and it'll be a mercy killing. I think she's calling for a mercy killing. That it can just all go away right now, Job, if you're just willing to say these things about God. One of the purposes of marriage is to have a spouse that's going to help you get to heaven. The biggest reason that I've ever seen young people fall away from the Lord is out of pursuit for a spouse. That they can't find somebody. And what they then do is they end up going with somebody that has a completely different worldview than they do. And you see the tugging away oftentimes happen. For you, if serving the Lord would mean that you had to be single a little longer to wait for the right person, would you still serve God in that situation? That's how Job disrupts, how Satan disrupts Job's family. Notice the next one is Job's flesh. Go back a few verses. Now we get the context for when Mrs. Job said those things to him. Look at Job chapter 2, verses 4 through 8. Then Satan answered the Lord and said, "Skin for skin, all that a man has he will give for his life. But stretch out your hand and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face." And the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, he is in your hand, only spare his life." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with loathsome sores from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And he took a piece of broken pottery with which to scrape himself while he sat in the ashes. By the way, with Job now sitting in the ashes, this sort of sets up the context for the rest of the dialogue that's going to happen with Job and his friends. You imagine him, he's sitting there and he's scraping the dead skin off of him. Why would he be doing that? Probably because it's really itchy, would be my guess. It's a way of trying to relieve some of the itch that's happening here. But here, notice what Satan's theory is here. That if I can just disrupt somebody's health, it's one thing to go through all kinds of difficulties around you, where you lose things that really mean a lot to you. But when it starts to affect your actual health, his theory is that people are so ultimately at their core self-centered that this is going to be what gets him to curse you. And before this happened, somebody could have told Job, well, Job, I know you've lost your finances and your family, but at least you have your health. And now he doesn't. I find it interesting that that Satan has the ability to affect Job's health, and the thing that he gives him are boils. Have you ever had one of those before? I've never had one before, but from what I understand, they're excruciating. From the crown of your head to the bottom of your feet. One of the things that's interesting as you go through the book of Job is looking at all the ways that Job talks about his health problems. One of the things that he talks about is that his skin had turned color and he was disfigured in these ways. And that he couldn't get any sleep, which I guess kind of goes without saying. And then when he finally can sleep, the only dreams that he has are nightmares. It's this terrible situation. I think one of the things that I really like to do is I like to read books. And back when there was more bookstores that you could actually walk around in. Have you ever noticed that these new Christian books come out, there's kind of like themes that the Christian books kind of track for a little while? Like a couple years ago, there's a lot of books written about hospitality, but we don't do that now because of the Rona. And now, like right now, there's other themes that like Christian folk are writing about. There was a couple of years ago, whenever I was going to the bookstores, and the theme that a lot of people were writing about was Christianity and health. So like there's books like The Daniel Fast, where if you just eat like Daniel ate, where he had the vegetables and he didn't have the wicked king's food, then he was going to be really healthy. Or there was another book called The Body Built by God or something like this, where if you just follow these things, these little hidden codes in the Bible, then you can like be really healthy and stuff. It's really cool. Until you read the book of Job, and you see somebody that's really wealthy and really healthy, and he's got all these things and he's really righteous, but all of it just gets taken away in an instant. His health does. And it has nothing to do with his unrighteousness. By the way, I'm still waiting for the John the Baptist diet, where he's just eating like the wild locusts and honey and all this kind of stuff. I don't think that book, if you want to make some money, go for it, Josh. All right, so here's the question. If your health was suddenly disrupted in a bad way, would you still serve God? Would you still see him as worthy of being served? I'm only 31 years old. I have never had any major health problems. So it's easy for me to say that I think I would. But I've also seen people go through some pretty hard things, and it really messes with the way that they can think accurately about the world and things like this. What would you do? Notice the final thing. The final thing that I think Satan has some influence on in this book are Job's friends. Look at Job chapter 2, verse 11. Now when Job's 3 friends heard of all this evil that had come upon him, they came each from his own place. Eliphaz the Temanite, by the way, in the book of Obadiah, Teman or something like that, was a city known for wisdom near Edom. Bildad the Shuhite, I guess he was a short. Zophar the Naamathite, I'm not sure what that was, but they made an appointment together to come to show him sympathy and comfort him. What was the motive of these 3 friends? They came so that they could blast Job, right? That's how I remember the friends. But in verse 11, they come together. They actually plan to come together. What good friends do that? You imagine that one of your good friends is hurt, and then you start like this text circle thing and everything, and you got your 3 friends that you're going to go and comfort. You make a plan to do it. That's what these friends did. And so I think when we read about these friends, we should look at them as Job's closest friends. How many of you like going to the hospital, seeing somebody suffer? I don't like doing that. You're going to typically do that kind of thing for people that you feel extra close to. So Job's friends, they come. Sociologists have said that you're lucky in your life to have 3 friends that you feel like you can share anything with. And I think Job, also being the envy of so many people, has got 3 friends. And what did they do after their 7 days of silence? They've got this picture of God, that God wouldn't have let this happen to Job unless Job had done something wrong. And all 3 of them, in one way or another, assume that Job must have done something wrong. And so in their different delicate and not so delicate ways, they start accusing him of all kinds of things. So look at Job 16. Job has a couple times where he assesses his friends. I actually want to do a sermon on this one day where I just look at the critiques that Job had of his friends and how that oftentimes fits how we might give bad advice to people. But look at Job 16, 1 and 2. Then Job answered and said, I have heard many such things. Miserable comforters are you all. There you go. You guys didn't do a very good job. When I first became a Christian, almost 13 years ago now, my mom got to know my friends pretty well. Like my mom is just kind of like a easy to get along with sort of person until you talk about the Bible. And when I became a Christian, one of my friends, he was at our house, and then I had to go to work. And it was normal for my friends to stay and chit-chat with my parents because they all became friends with them. So I left for work. And this was a few months after I became a Christian. I was trying to study with my best friend at the time, and he was at my house, and I leave. And after that day of work, my friend just completely stopped talking to me, and I had no idea why for a while. Until later, I found out that my mom told him that I had joined a cult, and that now that he believes in the Bible and he believes in God, like, you probably shouldn't talk to him anymore because I know that he's trying to get you to study the Bible. That was hard enough, and he was my best friend, but he wasn't even a Christian, and I was a new Christian. How hard is it when the people that you feel like betray you sometimes are actually brethren? What's one of the biggest excuses people have for walking away from Christianity? Well, those people were a bunch of hypocrites, so I'm done with it. Would you still serve God if so many Christians let you down? If so many Christians you felt like just had poor reasoning for some of the things that they said and did, would you get so frustrated that you just walk away from it completely? Or would you realize that if I'm going to accept God, he didn't adopt an only child. I'm not his only child. He's adopted a family. And somehow, some way, we got to learn to work together. Job's friends let him down. They made a lot of assumptions about him, which gets us to the verdict of the book. Was Satan right in this assessment? That Job will curse you to his face? Look at Job chapter 42. After all the friends give their speeches, and then God comes in the whirlwind. God comes in the whirlwind, and in chapters 38, 39, 40, 41, God basically takes Job on a trip to the zoo. And he says, have you thought about the ostrich? I made that one. Have you thought about Leviathan? Can you tame him? Can you tame these other hugely strong animals? And in all of this, God is saying to Job that I feed these animals. You've had these questions on why these things are happening in your life. Have you ever noticed how many times Job asks why questions throughout the book? Why? And then he doesn't really get an answer at the end of the book, but instead what he's shown is on this trip to the zoo that God created all of this, and he's the one that continually feeds these animals and takes care of them. For Job, what would that mean for him? God's above me. And there might have been some things that he said that he needs to retract and take away, but did he ever curse God? No. But after this vision that he has of God, look at Job 42, verses 5 and 6. I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore, I despise myself and repent. Some versions might have the idea of retracting, like retracting his words. So he repents or retracts in dust and ashes. At what point does Job say, I repent in dust and ashes of some of these things that I went too far in saying, although I never cursed you to your face? At what point does he say that? Is it after he gets everything restored back to him? No, it's before. Which confirms all the more that Job will serve God when he's still itchy and he's having to scrape the dead skin off, when none of his kids and none of his animals have been restored to him, nothing like that. He's still going to say, all right, God, I see you. And you're the only one worth serving. Back in James chapter 5, remember the text that we started out with in James 5? That you've seen the purpose of the Lord, how he's compassionate and merciful? Is it just me, or if you read the book of James, is the first thing that you think of is, oh yeah, God's mercy, yep. I don't know how much I think about that, unless James told me to think about that. How is it in this book that you see the mercy of God on display? in the book of Job? Maybe there's a couple ways that we could think about that. If the book of James ended by talking about steadfastness, it begins by talking about steadfastness as well. In James chapter 1, verses 3 and 4, the testing of your faith produces steadfastness, and let steadfastness, in other words, you can grin and bear it and be steadfast, but you can also at the same time refuse to have steadfastness, let it have its full effect, that you may be perfect, complete, lacking in nothing. How would this relate to Job? Have you ever had times before where you were like lifting weights? Can you tell that I don't lift weights? Where you were like lifting weights, and in the process you were like on your, for me it would be my second repetition or something like this, and you like start to feel weak, and you're trying to get to the third, and you feel like you're getting weaker and weaker. But the truth is that if you remain steadfast and you get to that 8th repetition or whatever it is that you're trying to do, you feel like you're getting weaker and weaker, but if you keep going, what's actually happening to you? You're actually getting stronger. That's actually what's happening. Have you ever had a time before where you felt like your faith was getting weaker and weaker and weaker because of the finances or family or flesh or your friends or something? You just kept feeling like you were getting weaker and weaker, but you weren't giving up. What does that mean? You're actually getting stronger. You might right now feel like you're getting weaker and weaker and weaker. But if you're not cursing God to his face, if you're still keeping the communication going, one of the things about Job throughout the book is that there'll be times where he's talking to his friends, and then you can imagine, just turn his face away from them and look up and pray. His friends never pray in the book. But Job is the one that will leave a conversation with his friends at times and start praying. He continually does that throughout the book. If you've kept the lines of communication going with God, if you haven't cursed him to his face, but you feel like you're getting weaker because of the trials, the truth is, you're probably actually getting stronger. And I think for Job, that he was made aware of greater things. His misunderstandings about God changed. Now when he gets everything doubled back, and we'll talk about that in just a moment, he has everything doubled back to him, but he can now assess it and know why he has these things in a greater way than he did before. I think Job grew through all of this, and I think you see God's mercy in that. But I think you also see his mercy in the fact that his latter days were blessed. Look at this. This will be the last thing we read in this. Job 42, verses 12 and 13. The Lord blessed the latter days of Job more than his beginning, and he had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 female donkeys. He also had 7 sons and 3 daughters. One of my best friends, when he was going through something really, really difficult in California, his wife had cheated on him. And one of the things that he started doing is he used to get on his motorcycle at night. And he would pray to God, and he'd say to God, God, I don't want to kill myself, but as I'm on this motorcycle ride, if you could send a car to hit me, I would be okay with that. In fact, if that's your will, please have that happen. Have you ever known somebody that you really looked up to talk that way? Kind of makes you a little uncomfortable, right? Until you realize that that's kind of Job, right? Like Job in Job 3, he curses the day that he was born. He wishes that it never would have happened. If you knew him, you would have looked up to him so much. But a righteous person can even say things like that. But my friend that was on his motorcycle rides, whenever he had moments of clarity, he kept telling himself, there's a Job 42, there's a Job 42, there's a Job 42. What he meant by that was not necessarily that in this life things are going to change. Sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't. But he kept telling himself, there's a Job 42, there's a Job 42. You notice at the end of this book here, what gets doubled? His animals get doubled, but what didn't get doubled? Did you notice it in verse 13? He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. Well, that's how many he had at the beginning, but when you look at the animals, from chapter 1 to chapter 42, the animals doubled, but the children didn't. Why is that the case? Have you ever wondered that? There's a lot of theories that people might have on that. One idea could be that because he never ultimately lost his children who did die in chapter 1, he didn't ultimately lose them because of the afterlife, right? Do you lose the animals? The animals are gone. They're done. There's no dogs in heaven. I'm sorry. But But in Job 42, because he never really lost his first 10 children, his children did get doubled. So in eternity, he has 20 of them. But the animals stay on this earth. They perish. And I wonder if through the eyes of faith, one of the things that Job realized in Job 19:25, I know that my Redeemer lives, and at last he will stand upon the earth. There's a lot of debate about what he means by that. Is he just talking generally that somehow, some way I'm going to be vindicated? Or through the eyes of faith, is he looking forward to the Messiah? That's a debatable issue. But ultimately, the answer of Job's cry here is found in Jesus, who had nothing for finances. He had nowhere to lay his head at night. His family thought he was out of his mind. His flesh was torn open when he was on the cross, and all of his friends forsook him in his most trying moment. All the things that Job went through are the same kinds of things that Jesus himself endured because he loves us. And who knows more about God right now? Do we know more about God, or did Job, in the time that he was living, know more about God? Job had a dim understanding of the afterlife. He didn't really have a clear picture of it. He had to learn a lot more about God through all of this. He didn't understand as much about God when he was alive on earth as we do right now, because we have God's full revelation. So the question that we have to ask ourselves is this: will we, who have a lesser knowledge of God, or will we who have a greater knowledge of God than Job did, will we still serve God when everything gets taken away, but we at least know we have the promise of heaven? What kind of faith do we have? Are we allowing the trials to become excuses to stop serving God? This is an opportunity for us to analyze those questions for ourselves. I hope that if there's anything that you're struggling with, that you'll have the courage to ask somebody for help. You can either come forward, or before you leave, please talk to somebody. If there's anything we can do for you, please let it be known while we stand and while we sing.